So welcome to our first of the Tiny Tom Talks. I'm happy to hand it over to Tom for a little bit of introduction, but we are going to do kind of a interview style today. So it's a little bit different than our normal Tom Talks.
Yes, I've thought about these short talks a lot, and some of them will be maybe a little more traditional, with a little more bit of PowerPoint presentation, some figures, and that where I think that's important to the explanation. But I thought this one really lent itself. This is really a conversation about remnants and about why they're important. So yeah, let's just get on with it, Jackie. What I want to, this is conversational, so that means you can be a part of the conversation too. There will be some time at the end, but you can also ask questions as we go. Really be a part of that conversation. I've always enjoyed that in classroom working, so the more we can do that today, the better.
And today's topic, of course, you saw the title is the 0.01%. So we're going to be talking about remnant prairies today. So Tom, can you just start off telling us what is a remnant and what do you mean when we talk about 0.01%?
Remnants, in the way that word is used today, it refers to areas that resemble, usually the judgment is being based on vegetation, but one assumes, at least the invertebrate community, resembles that of the land prior to European American settlement in the early 19th century. But that is, if you go back to the 0.01% comes from the Illinois Natural Areas Inventory work back in the 1970s, where they surveyed the entire state and found that 0.01% of it, in their language, was reflected the area's historical composition. I mean, all of these, of course, vague statements, but as you talk to natural areas people and ecological restorationists, that idea of a remnant is that it is, as best we can tell, similar to its condition prior to European American settlement.
I want to play a little bit of devil's advocate before we get into what makes remnants so special. So for thinking of a remnant, we're thinking of something almost in our minds as it's the same as it was before. But ecosystems can't really stay the same, especially with climate change. So why are we trying to hold on to these remnants? And is it impossible to keep hold on a single point in time?
This is a question that it's a question that's both asked about ecological restoration and the conservation of remnant landscapes. And the first thing I'd like to say is that it is difficult to manage a remnant, to control invasive weeds, to restore a fire regime. That is difficult, to be sure, but it is possible. In fact, it's being done in a number of areas in our county, and it's been being done in many more areas across the Chicago region. So it's certainly not impossible, and so I disagree with the criticism that it's impossible. Now, at some point later this century, climate change could make a lot of things that we think are difficult today may become impossible. I don't think any of us know that at this time, but for now and for the near future, protecting remnants is possible, just as restoring prairies and oak savannas is possible. We're doing it today, and we're doing it with increasing degrees of success. So I think that needs to be stated right up front. The second time is the sort of point in time criticism, and again, that's an oldie but goodie that goes back to the early days of ecological restoration in the late 80s and early 90s, and it sort of makes an intuitive sense. But if you start to think about it, yes, every moment in time since the Big Bang 15 billion years ago is, at least in some sense, the same. They're all moments in time. But if you're interested in the natural heritage of Illinois, sometimes they're more important than others. What's left to us today are fragments of a landscape that existed prior to European American settlement. And so that becomes a very important, significant time period. It's not a moment in time, but a time period that we can use as a reference to understand our conservation today. So, I mean, yeah, so I guess that's my answer to that question. One is that we're already doing it, and the second one is it makes perfect sense to use that pre-European settlement time period. I mean, if we could glimpse the world 6,000 years ago, we might use that, but we can't. What we've got left are fragments of a pre-European settlement landscape that we use.
So something that we often talk about with remnants too is, if there's something really good, like a rare plant population or something like that, if we deem it good or useful, why wouldn't we just focus on that thing with our management of that area?
It's a good question because it's one that I've heard, that one comes more from the scientific community. Because scientists are used to breaking a problem down into its individual components and solving the problem on that basis. It's a little bit different in land management. I mean, if we take a system apart, let's say we pick out a rare orchid and we just manage for the orchid. I mean, maybe we can grow it in a greenhouse, or we can grow it in a special garden in some prepared outdoor landscape, and there we've got lots of rare orchids, and so they're not so rare. But I think that's really taking the same approach to conservation the rest of our society took the landscape 200 years ago, and that's managing for one or a very few things, whether it's soil productivity or timber, and forgetting everything else, and you end up distorting the landscape greatly. And that's not really conservation, at least in conservation in the way we know it today. So it's both, I think, exploitive, even if maybe you're exploiting it for a rare orchid, you still destroy the original landscape for one thing, and that's not really what conservation does.
So you mentioned earlier, we're trying to control weeds in these remnant areas, but another way to look at weeds is it's kind of a form of natural selection. Are we making the area less and less natural by tinkering with it? There's natural processes of natural selection and competition. What do you think about that?
This one, part of it's a good question. Part of it, and this has been asked by a number of, or a point made by a number of scientists over the last 30 years that I'm aware of, natural selection being that key process first announced by Charles Darwin in 1859, and we still understand it today as a sort of a prime mover of evolution. And I guess if we go back to Darwin, natural selection has been going on for 3.5 billion years since there was life on Earth, and it's going on in every single square centimeter of the Earth. Anywhere there's living things, natural selection is going on, and it's going on in our natural areas today, and it would be going on whether we restored them or not. There would be competition and selection. I mean, I guess the point of conservation is what we're addressing are populations of plants and animals that have suffered from an unnatural transformation of a landscape by our society, and we're doing that by introducing management. So, no, you don't worry about natural selection. It will be around in 1 billion years long after we're gone. I don't think we need to worry about that. And the argument for naturalness to me goes down a rabbit hole. The word natural really doesn't help us very much now, because if we don't do anything, we're just allowing the areas to be swamped by influences from the developed world around it. If we do something, of course, we're intentionally involving ourselves in nature, but we really don't have a third choice. There isn't a third choice that we can go back to in nature that doesn't include influences of the society we live in today. And to choose the unintentional abusive landscapes, which is what's happening out there today, over the intentional, careful management of landscapes seems a little bit wrong-headed to me.
I want to switch gears and talk about some of the positives of remnants. Maybe some of these are things we take for granted, but let's talk about, why do you think we should conserve remnants and what's really so special about them?
But I think that question gets to the heart of it, because I really haven't so far. I really haven't told you why remnants are important. I've only sort of, like a fencing match, I've parried the thrusts of the opponents, but I haven't really told you why they're important. I think it's I think the answer is it's either intuitively obvious or it's completely opaque. I mean, for those of us who are conservationists, the value of nature and the beauty and diversity of life is intuitively obvious, and so the remnant is valuable. I mean, if we I mean, we conserve a remnant prairie for the same reason we conserve a Civil War battlefield or a cherished family table, because the battlefield tells us who we are as American citizens. It's a part of my identity, and it tells me who I am, just as being a part of a family means taking part in cherishing and holding on to certain parts of the family's history. And remnants are the same way for conservationists. I mean, as soon as when the nation disappears, the Civil War battlefield disappears. When the family disappears, the family table disappears. Or it doesn't really disappear, but it's no longer a sacred object. And I mean, sacred in that sense of deserving reverence and respect. And a remnant is the same way. When the community people that value the remnant disappears, the remnant disappears. It just becomes another place, and it's subject to the same forces of degradation as are the rest of the landscape. So for me, the remnants, beauty and diversity of life in general, and remnants in particular, are a product of a relationship in which the value is generated by your commitment to it. It's not I can't pick out any universal utilitarian value of remnants, because I don't believe they really have very much of that. The value is in what you find in them, and the value to the community of people who call themselves conservationists is actually very high. They're really the quintessence of that model of nature that we're after today as managers.
So are remnants good for anything? Their usefulness or their ecosystem services, or is it just terms we like to throw around, like biodiversity?
Yeah, I may just disagree with some of my fellow conservationists today. I think going down the road of claiming they have great utilitarian value is the wrong way to go. I mean, the reason why there's only 0.01% of Illinois left today that might classify as a remnant is that they weren't very useful. Our society took an approach of usefulness and converted 99.99% of the landscape to lands that were more useful to them. Even when there are oak trees left that were used for grazing cattle or other livestock, the prairies were plowed up. Eventually, the prairies could have been turned into housing developments or strip malls or roads. I mean, we took the land and we converted it to more useful forms, and the remnant isn't useful in that utilitarian sense of the word useful, which I think is a good one to keep. So I guess my answer would be no, they're really not useful in that practical, pragmatic sense of being useful for me and for society, and in some way producing, income and wealth.
Earlier, you kind of touched on the idea of naturalness, and of course, we know Native people have been on the landscape for thousands of years. They're a big part of why prairies evolved. Isn't that kind of odd that we still think of remnants as areas that weren't impacted by people?
No, this is a theme I've been teaching about for over 34 years now, and I can remember very early on. It's either 1990 or 1991, I was addressing a group, and I made the point that our landscapes would have looked fundamentally different today had there been no people in North America prior to European American settlement. And I remember the horrified expression on the woman in the front row, as if I had just taken something away from her that she was terribly offended by. I think the natural areas community is more used to that idea today, but but I think it is still undervalued by some. In my vision as an ecologist working here for 30 some years, I don't think there's any question that this would have been a mixed deciduous forest of some sort or other had there been no human beings living in this area and using fire on a regular basis. I mean, that's a big question, and we'd have to then talk about, well, what would the flora and fauna have been here? I don't want to go into that sort of digression, but certainly native peoples were a part of shaping the landscape for upwards of 13,000 years here, and it would have been a very different place had they not been here. So whether or not that, some people say that doesn't make it natural, but to me, again, that makes the word natural rather useless in its use in conservation today, because that is Illinois. And if you're going to reject Illinois before European settlement, what is conservation supposed to be doing?
So the last thing I want to kind of clarify is, you think remnants are special because of our relationship with the land? Is that right? Versus some kind of like scientific value too. Of course, there is some of that as well, but you talk a little bit more about the relationship.
Well, I mean, there are many, many important things about remnants that are revealed by science and by people like me that might study the soils and remnants and try to find out how those soils differ from areas that have been under agriculture for 200 years, or study some plant-animal relationship, maybe pollinators and rare orchid species or something within remnants. So they have scientific value. And my point in terms of the utilitarian value was, it's really the same point our society makes on a daily basis, as it looks at the landscape and uses things pervasively 99.99% of the landscape. So in that sense, remnants aren't useful. They're important and they're valuable to conservationists, but they're not useful in a practical economic sense. I think the reason I focus on relationships is I think that is quite literally the heart of conservation. I don't know of not a single conservationist that has been at it for more than a few years that if you ask them wouldn't say, yes, of course I love nature. Nature has become important to them. It's become a part of them. And as they study nature, they learn about it and they learn what's been lost, and then they want to do something about it, and they become a conservationist. That's been the foundation of conservation over the 35 years or so I've been kind of working in it in the Midwest. And it seems to me that's the best foundation going forward. That's how we should articulate the value of the beauty and diversity of life, and of remnants in particular. Because if we can't communicate that appreciation of nature and that love of nature, we're sunk. I think intellectual arguments and arguments for ecosystem services are really going to fall on deaf ears in terms of forming a much larger and more diverse conservation movement, which is what we need today going into the future. So yes, it's not really a scientific or a pragmatic or an economic argument. It's a relational argument or a moral argument or an argument for this sense of belonging that I feel, and I think other conservationists feel when they're working on the landscape.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that, Tom. We do want to open it up for questions from all of you. So again, if you would like to share a question or perhaps an experience of nature that makes you feel like you have a relationship with the land, feel free to unmute and share, or you can again add that in the chat. Any takers out there? For my part, I think a lot of the reason I got involved in conservation is, the wildlife and the plants and everything are cool. They're very interesting, but I think a lot of it was growing up as a kid, walking around outside barefoot by the lake and going on hikes with my mom and you get that kind of relationship with place too, and it really forms something from the heart. It's not just the scientific value. So I know I appreciate the conversation too.
Yeah, I could tell you a long story about my own association with nature, but I didn't really want to make this into my own personal storytelling. But it goes back to very early youth and working with nature. But I didn't really come to conservation until I was in my late 20s, almost 30 years old. And I don't think I ever really thought about it or considered it as a possibility of a profession back in the 1960s and 1970s. It just never seemed possible. I don't know if someone had actually talked to me about it. Maybe I would have, but the more you study it, the closer you get to it, the more you love it, and the more it becomes a part of you, and the more you want to find out what's going on and what's being lost and what you can do to try to help the situation. And I repeat that if that's the reason I became a conservationist, if that's the reason Jackie became a conservationist, if that's the reason that Ed Collins and every other conservationist became a conservationist, it seems to me that's what we should be communicating to other people as a way of attracting them to the field of conservation. It's a life transforming bond that you form with nature through its study and through working with it. And that's what I think people are looking for. They're not necessarily get up in the morning worried about a tiny bit more of water infiltration on a remnant or our natural landscape. That's not really what drives them. But I think the opportunity to expand their life and to give them an appreciation for a whole universe of beauty, that is something I think that needs to be in the forefront of how we present conservation to the public.
We got a couple of questions in the chat while we were chatting there. So first one, how many remnant ecosystems are there left in McHenry County? Are we talking like 1 to 10, 100 or more?
I would say it's probably, I didn't actually count them. And the word remnant, is a subjective word. It's not like there's a Webster's dictionary version of that, and we know when we got to a remnant, we could go down a checklist and find it. It's a matter of what appears to us as resembling the past. And I would say it's probably between 10 and 30 in the county. Some of them really very small. We've got a few tiny little remnant areas within Glacial Park. I mean, very tiny, but they're convincingly representing something from the past. And for me, that makes it a remnant. Yeah, Ed Collins would probably have a better idea of the number of remnants in the county, but some of it's subjective, but it's not hundreds. And it's not just, 10 or 12, but it's somewhere in between.
Another question for you. If you're managing a remnant prairie or some other type of really pristine ecosystem, do you just use the existing seed bank or do you add external seed from similar ecosystems?
In general, when the conservation district is managing a remnant landscape, generally the word remnant means it has a population of plants that we don't want to muddle around with. And what we're going to do is we're going to try to remove weed competition, reestablish the proper burn regime, fix any other sort of dangers to the hydrology of the site or whatever, and then allow those populations to reproduce on their own. I mean, we may be restoring areas around that. In fact, we often are trying to insulate them from outside influences, and so there are some genes from plants that are growing in the neighborhood that are filtering into remnants. There's no way we can put up a magic force field around them, but our intention is to try to save what's there and to foster its growth, really, of all the plants and animals that are out there.
You had a comment in the chat, and this will probably be the last one unless we get any others that pop up in the next minute. But said, thank you both. It's a husband and a wife duo. I won't give away your names, so they're not in the recording, but they work along each other in nature and feels very privileged to go along with their spouse, enjoy her and all the work that we do, as well as other people like us. So thank you. A very nice compliment.
Thank you.
And I'm going to drop a link in the chat for our future Tom Talks. We are doing a mini series, so every Thursday at 2:30 p.m. for the next several weeks. And we are hoping to get more questions from you and that we can focus these on common questions from our volunteers and people that are interested in the conservation district. So hope you check that out. And when we get the recording posted, it'll be on our @DiscoverMCCD channel on YouTube under the Tom Talks playlist. So we hope you enjoyed our first Tiny Tom Talks.
Thank you.
All right, have a wonderful day.